YouTube. I am Shaggy, I am Philalitheia, and I have been working on This Is Not Robert Longshore, my literary work, narrative literary work. I haven't been alone in this era, so the promised work of explaining ego and Carl Jung's approach and why the esoteric and Carl Jung's approach, modern esoteric and Carl Jung's approach are dangerous. I have my notes somewhere with me. They're here in this notebook. Um, I just don't want to do it. I don't want to do it with this sound above me, and nobody's given me any commentary whether they'll watch it even with that. So right now my plan is to do it in the tent, but it might be too cold to be comfortable for that. So somebody could watch one of these and give me some feedback. In the meantime, I've come to a place in my writing where I've written myself into a moment that I could borrow from old drafts. And this is why I wrote those old drafts, is I decided to, instead of approaching this as a series of novels, I decided I was going to approach it as a series of episodes, more like a comic book or a television show than like a typical novel. Because the way writing used to be done is episodic like this. And so books like even David Copperfield, like all of his work, I can't think of the author's name right now, but the guy that did Christmas Story, all of his work was episodic. And so it developed and changed depending on what people liked and what people didn't like from episode to episode, like a TV show, like a radio show. And so I'm aping radio and TV shows and that style episodic narrative storytelling, which can become novels, but like David Copperfield isn't a novel, it's an episodically published narrative fiction. And so I'm doing that. I'm aping that because I want the social sea level to be higher. I want the intellectual discourse around art to be better, and I want to do something that's so impressive nobody will be able to understand it for decades. Because I've been told I have no ambition. So I'm going to read this, and I want to know how much of this is salvageable and how much of it I need to just rewrite for what I'm doing now. And I'm inviting you to join me to build interest in what I'm doing. So thank you for being here. I'm going to turn my face off. And here we go. I know my childhood was unusual. I did not know the full extent of just how unusual, how strange, honestly, were the conditions of my birth and early childhood. It would not be until my 20s, well after this book we are only just beginning, that I would come to contextualize the reality of my parents and their gravity. But it is during this, the first story of my life which matters, or ought to matter, in yours, that I was first confronted by my ignorance. And it is also herein that I was first bitten by that cosmic serpent which coils in the effulgent dark, that eternal chaos. Her. The last I saw of my parents, I was 6 summers old. My mother was a Norse vulva. I don't know whether she were a Dane, a Swede, or Norwegian, what. My father was, I believed until the events of this, our book, a simple Welsh sheep herder. I was the 13th of 14 children, of whom I was aware by 25 summers alive. The first 12 were by 2 women who predeceased my birth, and my mother's daughter by my father. All that I remember about her is swaddling clothes and fiery red curls. I was 5 springs old when she was born. I never understood as a boy how my father could get my straight black hair and her red curls upon the same woman. It never occurred to me before then that he had black curls. I had forgotten his face entirely within 5 years of leaving his home. If forgetting my father's face were a thing I meant to do, I have no reason to think it was. He certainly was not unkind to me. It was not a difficult thing to do. I rarely saw him those first 6 years. Fathers of 13, eventually to be 14, have other things to do. Just managing his adult children would have been enough. My first memories are of my mother, of her telling me stories and singing me songs in the languages of her people, while I helped, in my way, with her woman's work. My memory of my father is that he was a great thinker and a thoughtful storyteller. Things changed the spring before my sixth summer. My sister was born. You might expect it was the change in attention. My mother might say it was the influence of the neighborhood boys. My father may have blamed that goddamn Scalder and his pagan adventure songs, but I never thought about these things. My mother, while a Norse witch and a devil woman, as my father often called her, was a good wife. The Welsh had been Christian since before St. Augustine made his famous trip to the island. I don't remember much about my father, not before that summer, 900, but I remember he was fond of his people and fiercely proud of the antiquity of their faith. Augustine thought to come here like Emperor Claudius and Julius before him, to come a conquerin' like a veeny weedy weechy princeps. What he found sent him home with his tail between his legs. Cymry, a whole people who speak better Latin than he ever could, and who never once served as a Manichaean whore. It surprised me to learn that a Manichaean was not a male prostitute sometime later in my life. The long and short of it is that in addition to speaking with and teaching me the 3 dialects of Old Norse, then just Norse, she also taught me the Gaelic languages of the Irish, Scots, and Cymry, in addition to the tongues of the Angles and Saxons, the Church, and the Greeks. I didn't know that not everyone's mother spoke so many languages so well. I could recite not just those poems and stories which would come to fill the Eddas after their composition in, still, hundreds of years, from memory. I could do the Gospels in Latin and Greek without having to translate from one to the other, the books of Genesis and Exodus in Greek, not Hebrew or Aramaic, the Odyssey and the Iliad in Greek, and she made me translate it to her in the Proto-English of the Anglo-Saxons on the fly once. And Celtic myths the world, and sadly I, have forgotten, including, but in now a no limited way, to tales of King Arthur no one will ever hear again. I would be lying if I said I didn't notice a change in my relationship with my mother once my sister came about. I'd heard of places like Cornwall and Powys and Somerset. Powys, maybe is how that's pronounced? I'm not sure. Powys is how I'm saying it. I knew that they said Cornwall was important. Jesus had built a church there with his dad, and Arthur kept his capital there. He kept it in Vericonium, too. But I didn't know those were different places. I got it in my head that the mystery began in Melrose. I don't know why. Melrose is on the Scottish border, to the north. Maybe I romanticized the pilgrims who were on their way to there with their stories about St. Cuthbert and his perfect wisdom. They were going to a place they call in English Holy Island, Lindisfarne. I couldn't tell you why, I don't know, but I knew what I had to do. I had to go north, to, as I believed, the land of my cousin's hero. Maybe I thought Cuthbert had the answers to my questions, like some kind of Christian Mimir. I could sense in that way that children have, and do, that knowing intuition, which Plato likened not to revelation and thinking learning, but to memory, that my parents were at odds over the man I would become and was meant to be. My father already had 9 sons, a prodigious amount. Later, when I heard the song that goes, "Many sons had Father Abraham, I am one of them and so are you," I will, without fail, think of what memories of my father I can find floating around inside the memory, or the library, of my mind. Because of the events of this first book, the experience will never be a pleasant one. I will always wonder whether I am remembering my father or another visitation from him, the Yaldabaoth. The eldest of my father's 9 sons was already 19 when I was born. My sense from him was that I was, first, my mother's son. I lived in her house. I ate with her. I slept with her. I did not live in the house of my father. As far I am sure now, as my brothers, especially my eldest brother, were concerned, I was not a member of my father's household. But whatever else was meant, I would be a good Cymry. I would be Christian, and I would be good. I never much got the sense my mother had any interest in me being either of those things. Kukulan certainly didn't seem very Christian, nor Arthur. His best friend was a pagan wizard. Jesus didn't have any wizard friends. He was the wizard. Something strange was going on with the stories, and, as I understood it, the present and immediate history of my people. I could smell a lie afoot. Maybe I was a better Scot than I gave myself credit for, because I went a hunting for it. My Welsh king, Anerod, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, struck out in revenge against the Mercians, defeating them at some river and quelling rebellions throughout the Powys countryside. It wasn't as death that I arrived in Lindisfarne. They will say in the 1900s, after I am gone, that if you know what you're doing and stare into a red light with ping pong balls taped to your eyes, you will be able to talk to the dead. They will say, when they are asked why the things the dead and other never alive entities predict never happen exactly when they predict, that time is funny on the other side. Time is, indeed, funny on this side. The island of Lindisfarne is located in Northumbria, at the pinched neck where England and Scotland divide themselves. If Britain is a woman in a poofy skirt from profile with an enormous head. The area was important in the 550s. I didn't know that it wasn't the 550s. That mythic time in the island's past, a century removed from the Arthur of the 450s, just in time for cyclical time to repeat itself, and for another mythical king, by later generations to be eternalized in song as yet another, the same even, Arthur. But that's what they did with the Arthur of the 450s too, isn't it? They just took the old stories, the same stories the people of Britain and Brittany had been singing to one another about their king's mythic since before the time of Claudius, forgot the irrelevant details, and replaced them with relevant specifics about the current king, alive, and then after death. The songs never change. The names never change. The stars in the sky go round and round and round about their procession. The only thing that ever changes is the specifics. When, that is, you live in cyclical time. When you live in linear time, you have to constantly convince yourself the past isn't repeating, it's just rhyming. Actually, it's not even rhyming, because rhymes come in patterns and schemes. I would learn, upon that holy island in that town, Lindisfarne, that my ancestral people, the Britons, were once the only people who lived on this island, Britain. They were many tribes, but they were one people. When the Romans came, there became two people, Roman Britons and British Britons, and the Picts. But around Lindisfarne, they preferred that I not talk about the Picts. Death came to the island, they told me, 400 years before. That's why the Romans left. The death which stalked the land, a plague, a great dying. The land was left empty, that's what they told me. Much of what had been beautiful farmland and pasturage, happy, well-fed homes and walled, well-dressed cities, was not ruined. Ruined and left to stand dead. Well-dressed cities was left ruined. Ruined and left to stand dead and empty like a skeleton, weathering away to nothing on a bleak and barren hillside. But the Christians, by the grace and with the love of God, built an abbey here. And the abbey, because of its miracles and because of the works of saints like Cuthbert, brought pilgrims from all over the world, and the abbey got rich. Eventually, my ancestral people, the Britons, would fight a coalition battle here against the English-speaking Saxons. The men of the old town told me that halted their advances through these lands, but I wasn't sure. These people were all Saxon as far as I could tell. Northumbrians spoke English. It seemed to me like both things couldn't be true. The land couldn't have been empty because of a creeping death which stalked the land, and the Saxons overran it with their boats and their weapons. But it didn't matter. I wanted to know, but it didn't matter. And it wouldn't matter. Not to me, not to historians, for almost 1,000 years. Nothing seemed to matter anymore, not in the face of what I'd found when I'd arrived in Lindisfarne. The Vikings had beaten me there. They weren't the infamous Great Heathen Army of 865. That wasn't 90 years before 881. That was 16 years ago. And if I'd asked around, I would have learned that Alfred repelled that army the year of my birth, 875. Dates, dates, dates. None of them is poisoned, but none of them is particularly relevant to anything either. Not for our purposes. The ruins of the Abbey of Lindisfarne still stand, from the time of their destruction to mine, to yours, as much as dead buildings can be said to stand. And I stood in front of them, a 6-year-old boy understanding for the first time that time is linear. Just because those things which brought me here, those people had happened, didn't mean they were still happening. Cuthbert was dead. The Lindisfarne Abbey was dead. But they weren't gone. The abbot of the new, as things go, smaller, poorer, less Viking-inviting, abbey offered to let me see his, Cuthbert's, final resting place. He insisted his body hadn't decayed even a little, that he still looked the same now, all these years after his death, as he did in life. And he answered prayers with miracles. I just stood in front of those ruins for days. I was too young to weep, to understand the profundity of my sorrow. I know I was horrified at the prospect of being allowed, nay, encouraged, to speak with a man so long dead. What if they hadn't actually opened it since he died, and all I saw was gleaming bones, wet with the juices of putrefaction and decay? I ate only when I was made to. I slept in the ruins until the abbot put a stop to that. I don't even know how long it went on. I don't remember. Those things I'd come to see, that I'd abandoned my family for, those men I'd planned to meet, they'd been dead for centuries. They'd been dead so long no one alive knew anyone who knew them. They could have been made up entirely, and who would even know? Did Cuthbert really do miracles? Did Arthur actually live? Here I was, confronted with a monument to the violence of the evil Norse pagan, the evil of my mother's people. That, fortunately, was too big a concept for my child's mind to even begin to grapple with. No, that would wait a few decades. I didn't know what to do. Do I just lie here and wait until I, too, am covered in dirt and moss and lichen and forgotten about? Powys, Cornwall, Arthur, my ancestors. That was all so long ago to me now. How could any of it possibly matter to my life now, on the other side of knowing how long ago they happened? Melancholy, and ennui are big words to be describing a 6-year-old's feelings and yet, as glad as the priests were to host me and answer my questions, I think they were happier to pack me off to London. Well, I like that. Let's see. You know what? I am alone in here, so I'm gonna do is I'm gonna close this, and I'm gonna go back live, and I'm going to do the first draft of Carl Jung, because that took less time than I thought it would. Well, thank you for checking this out. If you check it out, make sure to leave a comment, a like. If you're not subscribed, please do subscribe. If you aren't subscribed and you do subscribe, please leave that comment telling me that you have subscribed. And if you like that, tell me what you like about it. I'm really looking for somebody to say, man, I hope to hear more of this, so I can guide you to my Patreon where you just saw me read that from. Anyway, thank you. Until next time, I have been Shaggy. I am Philalitheia.